what I'm going to ask the panelists to do is to introduce themselves and their focus, and to give you just a quick view of what they think about digital health, what excites them the most, and then we'll just walk around. And then in the meantime, I hope there's lots and lots of questions from the audience, and we'll be very happy to keep you awake after lunch by having your questions thrown back at us. So over to you first.
Thanks. Probably worth looking at the interval between 2011 and 2012. At that interval, I had spent time puzzling over the importance of various factors in trying to shift drug discovery, make insights, better care, et cetera, and had, like several on the panel, spent enough time looking at different, what I say is au courant, the next version of what was going to change things. And in particular, I'd had the opportunity to live through the beginning, middle, and later phases of omics is going to solve everything and be a pathway to precision medicine. And it was at that point I felt that the scales had tipped. By that I mean the tools that were being developed that would allow one to measure various aspects, whether it's DNA, RNA, protein, the omics space, were actually passing by the information that we had about people and phenotypes. For a long time it was, God, we need all this omics data and we'll solve it all. But it basically, somewhere around 2011, 2012, became apparent, if it hadn't already happened, that the data that we're going to be able to generate on individuals, on samples, solutions, was actually not going to be the problem. The problem instead was that we were trying to match those omic quantities up with phenotypes that were pathetic. They were ones that had been evolved by tools, by traditions, by questions, by physicians like myself, with the tools that were there. But the ability to have a depth in dimension in phenotypes looked pretty poor. And I think since then, what we've, in an exciting way, seen is those dimensions of phenotyping, of recognizing that there needed to be more information about what was actually happening to people, what was actually longitudinal records, not snapshots, et cetera, was needed. And I think that sort of anticipation of what could happen, we're at the early part of. We're not even at the sort of first third of. But what becomes evident is that I think it's going to disrupt the way we have been struggling to make sense of how are we going to put things together and take lots of data and make some insights out of it.
So basically you're advocating that there's still room to actually look at predictive algorithms for clinical care based on other data sets that we're only starting to now unravel the implications. Is that right?
Yeah, put in the extreme, those groups who are figuring that what we're wanting, actually, what I would say is the same pathway of it's all going to make sense, no it doesn't, that went on in omics is about to go on in digital information. And until we figure out a way to navigate through that, it's not going to be very fun. And it's not about more data. It's not about more data. It's about actually trying to make sense of that.
Thank you. Lucien.
Well, as long as we're talking about digital health and not digital healthcare, I think that there's also some perspectives to share. I actually think that healthcare is broken. It's broken from a finance perspective. It's also broken from completely being siloed in each and every corner of it. It's expensive. We're doing over and over the same stuff over again. And then there's the other part where more and more digital tools can help also to come from a fix-it system into a more preventive system. At least that's the assumption that we're facing. I indeed do think that we're at the end of the beginning of this whole phase where things start to make sense, but also where citizens, once becoming patients, also start to make sense of their own data. also used to have some things instantaneously. Let's be honest, if I at 11 a.m. order something at Amazon and it is not being delivered at night, I get grumpy. And when I need an appointment at the physician, it takes me like 3 weeks. And when I go, I have to take a day off from my work and burn fossil fuels to get to that hospital and find that last parking spot at the rear end, as you know. And then I got this 11 a.m. appointment, and 2 minutes prior to 11 a.m. I'm at the front desk and somebody says, he's running late, take a seat. That's still how we arrange healthcare. And more digital tools, avatars, digital humans even. If you look at some of the initiatives of the Soul Machines, a Kiwi company in New Zealand, are going to change the way we interact within healthcare profoundly, I really think. And I actually think that we're in healthcare up to our own Copernican moment. I think it was Copernicus in the mid-1500s who proved that the sun was not circling the earth, but it was the other way around. And still in healthcare, patients circle the professionals. And maybe, and I do hope actually, that the pathways that we see right now do help us to create that system where we as professionals, either in real life or virtual, will start to circle patients and citizens and create that profound aspect of preventing life events as opposed to treating them.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hi everyone, my name is Divya Dhar, and I am super excited to be with you guys today. I read some of your bios for Leaders of Tomorrow, and I was really inspired by the group. So I'm really honored to be with you. I guess I'm very similar to what you mentioned. I've done healthcare from like beginning, starting off in med school, practicing, then going on to building an app where we were providing an app for hospitals to coordinate care for patients. And now I'm just skirting around the healthcare system because I learned from that healthcare is really difficult and broken. And the best way to do it is actually from outside of it and coming back in. And why did my life go through that transition? I came to understand one value system that healthcare has that fundamentally I don't believe in. And that's a value system that was espoused to me during med school, which was of patriarchy. It was a very patronizing system where we dictate, we believe we know the best for our patients, and it's our job to impart that knowledge on someone else. And I completely reject that notion. I don't want to be in front. I want to be right next to my users, my patients. And that's why I've kind of decided through this journey to skirt around and find a way to be right next to my users. So what I think about digital health is actually a healthcare system that is not led by professionals, but by our users, what I'm calling users instead of patients, because we shouldn't be calling people patients if they're well, and our job is to keep people well and not in a disease state. So yeah, so I guess the healthcare system of tomorrow is one that brings users on a journey of well-being. And they use each other's knowledge with data science, with machine learning to help them do that.
And Divya, maybe you could just for the audience, what does your company actually do?
Yeah, so essentially we're helping users share knowledge around their own skincare regimes so that they can learn from each other, and we're building machine learning computer vision systems to help them find the best skincare for themselves. And we can go into more details later.
Thank you. And there was a comment earlier today about the encroachment of the tech companies into health, and we're very honored to have Rhee, who's also a physician, but he happens to work for IBM Watson. So why don't you tell us about digital health from your side?
Yeah, so I'm an internist and pediatrician. I came right out of residency, practiced in underserved settings in DC and Baltimore in the US, and had the opportunity to work in the federal government for a number of years at NIH and HRSA and on the Affordable Care Act. And so I've been at IBM for 7 years, and when I reflect on the challenges that I witnessed and faced as a primary care physician serving in those underserved settings, I do think about the big data challenge that clinicians have, and my team members, whether they be pharmacists, social workers, psychologists, and how in many ways the healthcare system is built where the healthcare professionals, the patient does revolve in many ways around the healthcare professional. And if you think about the terminology we use, patient isn't necessarily an empowering term. And in fact, the fact that there's a waiting room and all these other patriarchal type of systems, it is challenging. And so I believe that big data and the work that we're trying to do together could potentially change that dynamic. I do think big data has the potential of bringing truth and transparency to a lot of what's fragmented and challenging in healthcare. The fact that so much, it's like going to a restaurant and not knowing the price of the meal and getting the bill 6 months later and wondering, did I really order all that stuff? And so I think of what I've learned with my colleagues at IBM is about the 5 V's of big data. It's about the volume of this data that we'll all produce. I do think the social determinants of health, especially as I use the acronym of health, housing, education, access to healthy choices, labor and employment, transportation, and a holistic view of health is very important. So that volume, the variety of those pieces, the velocity of that data as you think about wearables and the Internet of Things, and also the veracity of that data, because in much of healthcare, what we've discovered is a lot of the data that's entered into electronic medical records or other places are not necessarily good data, or there might be inaccurate data. We've seen through the application of Watson that in many cases there are multiple providers who have multiple opinions about the same patient, and it's got to be reconciled. But the last V is value, and I think what we're heading towards with a $8 trillion industry for 8 billion people across the globe, and in places like the UK and the US where we're challenged with cost and quality, we've got to get value out of the system. And thinking about how we can get value out of that big data is going to be very essential.
So just one provocative question, because people have different views, but is it okay should people be worried about health tech really starting to encroach on people's lives and on health as an issue, or are you comfortable with it as a physician?
I think
clearly you are employed by IBM, so I understand, but no, just your view.
So my perspective is obviously biased from the perspective of IBM. So I view kind of my movement into health tech, I have to admit, going from a primary care doc to a health policy maker and then going to IBM, iconic company that's been around 107 years and has been a part of every major technological revolution, I would suggest, and has gone through some ups and downs. And I view, from my perspective, the transition has been great. It's been an opportunity to be connected to a values-based company, which I think is essential as we address this. But when I look broader across tech, I do get concerned and I get engaged, and we're all going to have to get engaged in the role of tech and how it can connect with health and healthcare, and how that data needs to be secure, private, and how we need to make sure it's patient-centered or consumer-centric. And there's so many stakeholders, like the other thing I like to say about healthcare, everyone wants to disrupt and innovate, but no one wants to really change. And that's hard, because in order for us to innovate and disrupt, some of these different stakeholders who are used to things a certain way will have to change, whether they be providers or payers or policymakers or product manufacturers, pharma. There's going to be a huge need for that change. And I do think we can catalyze that, but ultimately a lot of these stakeholders have to change.
Okay. So I'm going to invite questions from the audience, because we have lots of questions we could debate amongst ourselves. But are there kind of burning questions in the audience? Please, go ahead.
So this is a question to you, Dr. Ameet. My name is Tina, and
Hi.
I'm a master's student at the University of Copenhagen. If digital health has the potential to democratize the health and to empower patients, what role would the medical doctor have in the future?
So I think it's a great question, and we should ask several of the panelists as well. But so it is my contention that actually getting the patient more relevant information that they can be part of a decision will help the doctor. I think there was a discussion about the patriarchal system that exists in many healthcare in many countries, and at the equalization of information that's relevant, that an expert and a patient can have a dialogue which is meaningful for them. And this is more the question about personalized. I know it's a contentious term, but a personalized dialogue between a doctor and a patient is, what do you want as a patient? What are your expectations? How does it fit into your life? And how does it fit into the healthcare system? And having that information available where the doctor's able to do that in a meaningful way and to have a deep conversation about it, I think it actually empowers both the patient and the doctor. And it's, when I go to see a doctor, even as a physician myself, I don't want them to quote me the average data in the latest trial that says this is the therapeutic. I want to know, is it still going to work for me with my family, my situation, where I live, and in my particular country with the healthcare system? So I think that this ability to exchange that information, to me, is very important. And I hope it empowers the physician, not disempowers the physician. That's just a view. I don't know if you want to...
I think it's an open question. I think it's an open question because there are two paths that may intermingle. One path, which is the one that is picked up by most of the media and is, I think, quite likely, is that so think of the doctor as a parochial AI machine. When you go to a doctor, okay, the thing that you're really asking them to do is to take input in, synthesize, use their algorithms, and come up with something that should be done. Okay? I call it parochial because it's totally biased by what that person got a chance to learn, what they forgot, what they should have learned, and eventually, I think there's no question, it's not just in imaging, no question that some element of a central AI machine will end up having a much more rigorous ability to synthesize opportunities. That does not mean correct decisions, but opportunities. One version of that is that we're headed towards a world where actually the role of quote-unquote doctor is turned into a nurse. Okay? And that there is an autonomous AI machine which is actually allowing that person who wants to care for that person to help understand what's happening with that person at some level, but that the sort of central AI machine is autonomous. The alternate path is to think about it as augmented AI. And I think this is an interesting, harder path, but it's one that says that what is going to be most helpful, similar to the transition in any of the games that were first taken on by AI approaches, is that whatever an AI machine can do, an AI machine plus a human can do a little better. And so what I mean by augmented is one in which that central AI machine has maybe two people involved. One, the physician sitting next to it, and the other is the individual, whether you call that individual a user or a patient individual. And this path in life as to whether the physician turns into an autonomous AI with primary nurse assistant world, or whether in fact the individual comes up and says, I'm really not interested in what that autonomous AI machine is saying about me. I'm interested in what it is that I want to do, the individual, and is closest to co-pilots in airliners. So when you look at how someone navigates in a plane, she or he is working with a co-pilot, an extremely sophisticated navigation system that's keeping them in the center. So I think the real question is, are we going to go an autonomous path, or are we going to go some augmented path? And what is the role of the individual, and can that push back? And how do they push back on those other two?
But you are advocating that actually discussions will still become potentially more data-driven, with maybe some more objectivity to the data for the dialogue to take place. Is that fair? So there's much more a data-driven decision at a time of a consultation between a doctor and a patient. Is that because you're getting much more data from many sources to inform a physician, so that there's less bias at the time of that decision?
I mean, either way, I think it's shifting from parochial AI to central AI machine. The question is that central AI machine going to feel as if it can make better decisions in a HAL 2001-like way, or is it going to be one where the individual with someone who is there in the room with them and the machine become, and who puts, what puts, notice I said what, not who, what puts whom in front of whom? That's going to be the hard thing.
Divya, did you have a view on that question as well?
Very similarly, I can't wait for the world where the doctor becomes defunct. I kind of like realized, I kind of realized it's like, I graduated from med school not that long ago, and I was asking myself, like, how much longer would I have this job if I stayed in it with the world that it is today? And I was like, probably another 30 years. So it'll probably become defunct before I'm ready to retire. And that was an interesting question. Most people probably don't get to ask themselves that at the beginning of their career. And that's because, blacksmiths used to be a thing, now they're not. And when will that change for us? And so very similar to what I realized, majority of what I was doing was like a decision tree. Like, I got lots of information, and then at the end I was just like, it's going to be this path or this path or this path. I'm going to run some tests, and if it's this one, I'm going to go down this path. It is literally a computer. I'm like, when do I use my creativity in this process at all? And very few cases when I asked my older consultants, how often do you actually think on your job? They're like, maybe twice a week. Twice a week for someone who's like, arguably some of the smartest people who are doing some of the smartest things on the planet are thinking on their feet twice a week. And I was like, that is ridiculous. Like, I don't know how you get to how you get to sustain yourself for 30 to 50 years in an industry where you're only thinking twice a week. Once you get to a certain position, I was thinking a lot because I was very young, and as a junior doctor, I was thinking much more than my senior doctors were. So I guess my point being, like, if that is the process of medicine today, it definitely will help our patients and consumers if we can involve AI in that. And honestly, it will be good for doctors too, because then we can get on to being more creative and using our minds for something more interesting than like the silly repetitive tasks that we were spending 40% of my job on.
Okay, Lucien, please prep up some other questions as well. Lucien, you had a view.
Well, one of the other things we obviously see is that healthcare will be doubling in demand. Probably within the same budget, if not less. So we have to come up with smart solutions. If one of the solutions is to use that technology to help one of either sides of the brain of a physician, being able to rationalize some of the things and creating more room also for empathy next to creativity, I really do think that really could come in handy for that. The other thing is also and I think it was in 2011 when Stephen joined me at one of our conferences in Maastricht, where a colleague of mine, Professor Bas Bloem, had a TED talk that was called From God to Guide, and very graphically brought also into stage, and maybe that's also the transition that is going to happen from the almighty all-knower to being helped by technology. And I'm finalizing my new book, which is interestingly enough is called Augmented Healthcare, the End of the Beginning. So maybe it's timely for the book as well.
Thank you. Other questions? Lots. We'll start in the front, then work my way backwards, so don't forget, please, in the front.
Now there are multiple platforms for digital health. There are apps that take care of measure your heart rate and the distance you've walked and a lot of different things. Don't you feel there's a need for an integrative platform where all this can be combined together to analyze and give a more holistic idea of what the patient's needs and information is, and then provide a service? So considering there are technology experts here and an expert in sharing information, so what do people feel about integration?
Maybe we can invite Q.
Yeah. Reflecting on just the prior dialogue, I actually think healthcare is all about trust. So as you talked about the doctor, to me the doctor plays an important role, or the healthcare team, in being a trust broker for data. And so as I think about a micro team of a doctor, a pharmacist, a social worker, a patient, a caregiver, a broad range of these stakeholders, I think about that group. And I actually think it's essential to think about the role that, the time is usually the thing you lack the most, but I still practice a little bit. And that's one of the most fulfilling parts of practicing medicine is the trust that you build with patients. And many times that trust is built very quickly, and sometimes that takes years to build. So as I think about broader than that, outside of the healthcare system, the stakeholders I just referenced, and in many ways those stakeholders include governments, payers, purchasers or employers, and providers, and patients in terms of their advocacy groups, there's going to be challenges to connect these data sets onto that platform. So the technology exists to put this data on a cloud. The capabilities exist to bridge data sets together. But as we're seeing with some of the challenges we have with data with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, this issue of trust is so essential to bring these different stakeholders, that data together, and ultimately whose data is it? And who's empowered, ideally just the patient is empowered to know how his or her data is used. But language is power, and I would argue that I don't understand data science and AI as well as my colleagues at IBM do. As a primary care doctor, I would often ask for a cardiologist or an endocrinologist. So that team has to bring that trust together and empower the patient to ultimately know that. That group has to bring that cloud has to bring all these stakeholders together in a secure way that all these different stakeholders feel confident in. And I think we're at the early stages of that.
And just to kind of build on a previous discussion about data, structured, unstructured, standards, can you make sense of all the noise? Can you comment, because it's part of this, if there's so many different data sources, that even if you were to bring it together, what's your view on the utility of non-standard, unstructured data, and is it just noise? And how do you view it?
Yeah, I think there's extraordinary potential in structured and unstructured data, and most of our current potential we've analyzed is related to structured. Now, I think about my daughters who are in 2nd and 3rd grade, and how I just went to the teachers' conference for both of them and asked them and looked at their reading comprehension skills, and frankly, even seeing how they comprehend. So in unstructured data sets, as I think about it, how much do they recall in terms of knowledge? So humans, we have a limited ability to recall. Now, I would suggest that machines have an extraordinary ability to keep track. And I mean, a tool like Watson can read 800 million pages of text in a few seconds. I mean, we have a responsibility to look at how we can train those capabilities so that we can leverage that technology to read unstructured data sets. And I would suggest, while Dr. Friend was talking about this binary nature of autonomous versus augmented, I mean, I'm a big believer at IBM, we're a big believer in augmented intelligence. So I love BBC. I turn on to BBC, Star Trek's always there. I think the vision of computers in that future isn't related to HAL or Terminator. It's related to how they use computers in Star Trek, and whether it's Mr. Scott or Captain Kirk or Mr. Spock. The humans make the decisions, but they use the computer to bring the insights out of that big data. And the humans ultimately make that decision. So I'm excited to see that.
Is anyone else wants to comment on this platforms and integrating data?
I guess my thoughts around this are essentially, it's either going to come from the provider or the provider, meaning the doctors, something in the US like Kaiser, or an insurance company. And there are some clinics that have started opening up in the US. I'm more familiar with that system, such as IORA, such as Forward, that are really trying to become starting with primary healthcare, starting to integrate data from different sources and empowering patients. I think that's really exciting, but there's a massive opportunity, I actually think, in developing world, where insurance has only penetrated 5% of the market, such as in India, to create a completely new healthcare system. Like, if you think about Kaiser started like 100 odd years ago, what would today's Kaiser look like? And if we have the opportunity to build that, which we do right now in places like India and most of Africa, which is also low penetration insurance, there is a massive opportunity around re-incentivizing that system. And then if we can get that going, I think there will be reverse brain, where we will learn from that and come back to the West. So I'm very hopeful about that kind of future.
Thank you. And just to kind of make a comment, Apple already is building all of its phones with completely enabled for health technology to be integrated, right, including health records. So to keep this, it's going to be an interesting time going forward. Let's get to the next question. Going to go in the middle over there. Yeah, you're all young, so I can't use young gentlemen. I'm sorry.
I'm Dominic. I'm a bioinformatics PhD at STEM Centre Institute, Cambridge. My question is: do you foresee any negative effects of digital health revolution, which might be hard to foresee? A direct example would say the negative effects of social media on mental health, which we can see in adolescents who essentially become addicted to social health. And maybe a more indirect version would be, I don't know, an AI requires a value net, a poorly defined value net could lead to, decisions made in the hospital which the AI would know are immoral, but from a human standpoint would be judged upon.
So the ethical and the moral component as well.
Or just any
Yeah.
negative implications.
Yeah, who wants to take that? You want to add a comment?
Of course they will. From one end, there were crooks in the Middle Ages, and obviously they also will be crooks in the future. So from these developments that we see, things will go wrong. At first, things will improve. Secondly, we also will see the direct negative effects in the end of it. The other thing is that we're indeed at the beginning of these things where the benefit also has been, it's a trade-off. Sometimes you also see that the benefit not specifically in healthcare erupts, but in a different portion of our societal life. And that's also the case with a lot of studies within digital health at present. They only look at the portion of the physician, or is it better for the nurse, or is it effective within healthcare, where the costs of labor savings, for instance, are not incorporated at all. So I think this is very early work, and we've all seen great big companies fail, like Theranos, just to name one. And I think the majority of us, a lot of people of us, thought that was a great development, where with one finger prick, you could have like 200 blood tests for $5. Again, this is part of the evolution of the revolution, or what do you like to call it? It's life, I think, actually.
Yeah, the misappropriation of data and even the biases it could lead to in getting anti-insure or not getting insurance because of your risks, or the kind of transparency of that information as prejudicial to you is actually something that's is everyone's very concerned about how that could evolve going forward. You have a comment, by the way. Just
I'm going to talk about some of this later, so I'll save that. But I wanted to give a particular that I think most people don't think about, but I'll bet that Rick Klausner, who talked on the panel earlier, has thought about. The ability to give someone information back about themselves is something that most think of as a direct benefit. I'm going to tell this person this is happening. Almost all of us make our ways through life with some element, probably close to 90% of the time, deluding ourselves and being in denial. One of the things that I don't think people have thought about is what is it going to be like when Jiminy Cricket equivalent conscience sits up on your shoulder and basically says, by the way, did you notice that you've done this for the 4th time in the last 3 days? And we get through life by sort of making sure things are out of our mind in order to go, it's okay, we're doing well. I think one of the things that we aren't expecting that is going to come up is as we give individuals a chance to co-pilot their life, the ability of figuring out what that switch should look like when some element of objectivity is brought into the world that actually we navigate pretty well when we stay in delusion. And what that's going to feel like is one that I've been thinking about. I think some companies are beginning to think about that most people are not thinking about.
Okay.
Thank you for the interesting talk. My name is Akash. I'm a master's student at a very close company. And my question actually comes from a couple of points which have already been mentioned. I was thinking about improving the productivity in the R&D process, and one key factor for that is improving access to sample improvements in access to sample and data for translational science, whether it's to SMEs or to the public. What can be done about that? Do we need models for that, or do we need new platforms or new models for collaborative research? I just want to get your sense.
Yeah, perfect. So the R&D process, or research in particular, anyone want to start?
Well, maybe one of the other ones
No?
first.
I'll give you a view. So I think that we heard today about where does the R&D process look at how digital health is going to transform, every part of the value chain. I'll work backwards. So certainly just running some of the most expensive part of trials today, and making sure that we can access, in electronic health record and do trials directly in the system if the data and the electronic health records are well structured. Can we actually now move to a point where we do distributed trials? People don't have to come into hospital, have all this done, they get all their testing at home, they trials at home, we can identify the right patients at home, and we actually test the new developments in the context of their home setting. So you're developing the real world data in a healthcare system and testing it in that, but with a relative discretion around the science. Now there's many organizations that are already partnering with companies that already try to do these distributed trials through the electronic health records. great in theory, still need to see much more of it, see its acceptability, but that could disrupt quite dramatically the heavy cost of running clinical trials, and it could speed it up and make it cheaper and make the data more relevant. But not every country in the world has a standard EHR. We don't have all of the outcomes we're trying to capture. So there's lots of limitations around that. But it's still something in aspiration going backwards. This whole role of then going to the other end, can we automate looking for new drugs through screening, through AI, through having the better diagnostic pathways and screening libraries and screening 20,000 per day. And that's also being applied right now quite widely across several companies. And that sort of library screening and having the molecular pathways loaded up onto systems which kind of pick out nodal pathways is beginning to happen. Many R&D organizations are already looking at that. And then there's the FDA is also trying to look at, can you do in silico prediction now? So they're encouraging looking some in silico predictive models to see whether or not we can look at the outcome, understand the benefits to given pathways. So there is a view across the entire value chain of how we can apply different technologies. But I have not seen, and maybe anyone can comment, anyone doing it systematically from end to end across the board. And so we still are in the vestiges of people doing these different demonstrations at the different phases. And at some point, the ecosystem will have to come together. But we're still a long way from that integrated process to fully validate. That's just my personal view from the observations. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment.
I mean, everything Ameet said right on. The only thing I would add is I like to simplify in terms of traditional evidence and real-world evidence. So the books might tell us, the knowledge might tell us that for this patient we have to treat with X, Y, or Z. But the real-world evidence shows that people like this would do better with treatment Y. And so the opportunity as we think about bringing these data sets together in a consented, secure way, the opportunity to give a clinician or a clinical team, and the patient, of course, in a shared decision-making process, the opportunity to see both the traditional evidence and the real-world evidence at that moment is going to be potentially powerful. And then the preferences of the patient, of course, and the provider play a role in that final decision of what is decided upon X, Y, or Z. I also think AI, as we've discovered, and we just announced this with Mayo Clinic, we've done applied AI, if you think about clinicaltrials.gov or all these different products, or the ability to read unstructured data, there's a lot of information out there about inclusion and exclusion criteria and a lot of times, unfortunately, the data that's out there is often incorrect, or we're discovering, but we have applied AI with a number of partners like Mayo Clinic who have been able to immediately eliminate 94% of the people who were eligible, potentially being considered for clinical trials for breast cancer, and then reduce the amount of time for screening from 1 hour and 50 minutes to 24 minutes. So a 78% reduction in time. And so there's going to be many opportunities to use AI to help improve the clinical trials recruitment process and also change the dynamic. Because when I was working at NIH and I was working as a co-PI with community-based participatory research in Baltimore, I remember, we get a $5 million grant to recruit 500 patients. And then we had a hard time recruiting patients. And we spent all these resources trying to recruit people. And there's going to be a future where that is simplified.
Yeah, sure. It is go.
Just a quick one. The descriptions so far have been clinical trials starting phase 3 going back. The one I wanted to go is outward. This week you may have seen in the news a group here in the UK that they built an algorithm using Twitter feeds to tell whether you're pregnant or not. And it was interesting because they said, we've done this and we're going to stop working on this and we're not going to make it public because we don't know what people would do it. It's a very, very interesting article on that. That ability to detect things using wearables and tracking what people are doing has a complex and that's different, tricky course, but I think there is no doubt that in the next 5 years, pharma companies will begin to use data on every person when a drug is released. So, and I think that the regulatory agencies are going to ask that we collect data on everyone, not have a phase 4 trial that says I did that. So right now we're working with the FDA on a project where we're looking at exploratory endpoints, wearables as exploratory endpoints to ask what could you track, what can you not for adverse effects, which as they move forward then could turn into ways of tracking those as they get approved. And this is particularly poignant for the immuno-oncologic agents that have some really strange, interesting adverse effects that actually might be able to be picked up. So what they're particularly interested in is, can we, when we're releasing a drug, do so earlier, less cost, and actually be able to figure out ways of using wearables and other ways to track. And I think that will become more and more useful and save a lot of money.
And you also asked another component of your question is, how does this data get shared, right? And so it's very interesting, you know, the question is, for example, you know, will the baseline project from Google, which will kind of put every omic into a kind of open database, can we use that as a reference for disease states? I'm aware that the Broad Institute is just about to, you know, publish the cell atlas of the body, which has every cell in the body with its expression, you know, characteristics as well. And can that then become a reference point that people can use as a library against a disease state? So you can actually start to identify pathways. I think much more of the collaboration around data sets, which are value, is something that is, I'd love to get the panel's view on, because if we can democratize the data, and in particular, if we can make it so that, you know, it's really used for public good and for health, and still find a way to protect privacy, you know, the question is, how much could that advance the healthcare delivery? And it's a very important point. So, question in the corner.
Hi, so I'm Rhee. I'm one of the community organizers for the conference. And well, thank you for the exciting panel and, you know, mentioning the death of the patient, the doctor, you know, making the level 3 more balanced. I'm just wondering, you know, who has the responsibility now, right? Who has the responsibility with regards to the final decision of what treatment to follow? And who has the responsibility of making sure that the data and the algorithms are being tapped into or are being well kept and all these kind of things? Because I think it's important to substitute who with what, but at the end of the day, somebody has to make a decision.
So there's a couple of questions right now. So one is the algorithm question, right? So let me just ask the algorithm question and start in the corner, and maybe you can have a comment on that cue. And Divya.
The algorithm, to me, this is where, in order for man or woman to trust a machine, if I'm talking about an algorithm, then you have to be transparent to how that algorithm was built, how it was trained, what data it's using, and what biases might be in that data set, whether it's literature biases or other types of biases. So that's, to me, where
But if it's open and accessible, is that more vulnerable, right?
Well,
I mean, targeted attacks.
yeah, this is where there's an intuitive challenge that we often have. We think, when I think of securing my data, securing my goods, my valuables, I think of securing it in a safe and keeping it protected and locking it several times over and having a security system. So you need that to have trust. That data has to be secure. But you need to create a facility in sharing that data in a trusted way between different stakeholders. And I think tools like blockchain will eventually evolve to transform how data is shared. Right now, candidly, I mean, my dad's got a number of medical issues and he's got 10 different doctors. It is so hard to get his data. I mean, it is challenging at different systems to get his data. I see a future where it'll be his data on the cloud, secure, but also, you know, he'll be able to choose who to share it with, whether it's me or another provider, and it'll be easy, but it's not there yet.
And just to provoke you a bit more on algorithms, how does IBM approach the bias in algorithms? Because that's a big question. When you machine learn or you augment learn and you know give them you're creating within the coding as well as the actual cases a bias, right?
Yeah.
So do you have a comment about that?
Yeah, I'd go with the simple term transparency. Now, there's a certain amount of transparency. I'm not going to suggest it's like, you know, we're sharing all the codes and everything like that. But there is a transparency where we believe AI and tools have to be a glass box versus a black box. And so, for example, the tool that we've built the most in the last few years, as Watson Health is only 3 years old, is with Memorial Sloan Kettering. So we've been very transparent. We're working with Memorial Sloan Kettering, and their cases, de-identified, and their oncologists are training Watson. And they've chosen 300 medical journals and 250 medical textbooks. It's transparent to the user as they provide links to why they're justifying these recommendations, which journal article, which textbook, and how they've been prioritized. And this is transparency. Now, many doctors in China, in India, in Thailand, it's been fascinating. We got folks in gastric cancer in Korea, doctors who are using it. Now it's used in over 10 countries across the globe. They're saying, I don't agree with this because I wouldn't agree with this study, and I think this study was biased. It didn't have Koreans in the study, or it didn't have people from China in the study. And so that transparency is essential in our view. And what's great is we provide supervised learning back to Watson because those insights are then brought back to the MSK oncologists, and it's fascinating for them to continue to train the system with the help of all these worldwide experts.
And just by the way, the FDA is now also kind of putting out that they want to see that the same data set, can you replicate that, and is the code transparent? So the two things, can you have two different ways to take the same data set and come up with a similar answer as a way part of this replication bias? So that's it's also coming in part of it. Can you just ask Divya, and then I'll come back to you? Please, Divya.
So I guess I will go to the next part of the question, which is about how do we make joint decision making. So Watson's helping us find information from lots of different places and putting it in front of us, but how does that patient actually make that decision with the doctor? I remember just meeting this 90-year-old woman who said to me, Divya, dear, in this country, I need to be my own doctor. And I was thinking, like, she's 90 and this is her viewpoint. But that's because she's grown up in a country where genuinely it's really hard to coordinate care for herself. You just talked about it from your own father's perspective with 10 different doctors. Like, who actually looks after this patient? Themselves. And I think it's similar to how when we were trained, when the internet first came about, we were trained, how do you recognize whether an article is good or not, what's fake news and what's not fake news. And a lot of it was about figuring out what the source is and figuring out whether that source is something you trust in. And I think we need to, with digital health, actually comes back to education as well. So you'd have to start helping people learn about their health at a more detailed level, understand what data science is, so that when they're having these conversations with their doctor, they have a common language to start from. So you can't just start with decision making from the top. It actually starts from the education level at primary school, secondary school, that we are now going to be living in a world where we're going to have AI helping us make healthcare decisions, and you need to be able to ask the kind of questions around where did the source come from, what kind of information did you use, and how do I make those decisions? So I think it's a much more holistic answer than just someone coming from the top and
Did you have a view? Yeah.
On the aspect of biases, the recognition that biases of input are probably as, if not more important than biases of interpretation. Sort of interesting because when you go by and you drill in on why is it that a vitamin is ordered, who is it that said blood pressure 120 over 80 is this, if you go through and you look at the recipes, the medical alchemy that drives decision making, it's pretty pathetic all the way around the board. And the biases that are in almost everything you go to, should I run 100 steps, should I do this, should I do that? And you drill down, you realize that the biases that are in our today's decision are rather strange. So I think it's sort of like the autonomous vehicles where there's a crash and someone goes, how could that crash occur? And then you realize that there are hundreds of thousands of deaths that go on from people. Look at sort of how the current system is going on that. But the thing that you asked that was I can't answer, that I don't know how to answer, is your question about an element of trust, or who is it that actually should be taking that responsibility in terms of making sure that it works well. I haven't seen evidence that governments do that very well. I haven't seen evidence that companies have been doing a very good job of it. And I think the thing to track is, what is it that is the incentive for that country or for that company? And where companies and countries have incentives that are to save money or to make things more effective, et cetera, you may ask whether they are the people who are going to be able to do that stewardship, particularly when those who don't know quite how to do it, the 14-year-old or the 78-year-old who is going to want to have some element of being involved may not be able to filter to the point where they actually, who want to make the decision, who could make it in their own, in a way that they may not have that input that would allow them. So I don't know how to answer it. I don't see it necessarily as the user. I don't see it necessarily as companies. I don't like who I see is probably likely to be doing that.
Yeah, and it's a big dilemma. You know, insurance companies, if I'm a physician, am I covered if I use an algorithm to support me in the decision going forward? So how is that all going to shape out? And there was a similar question about the ethics and morals. It's going to raise many societal questions that we're not ready to answer today, but hopefully you will actually work this through as the new generation coming through and actually helping us to unravel this. Other questions in the back? I'm going to take the person in the middle, just a tall gentleman. Yeah. And I'll come back to you. No, there's one after you.
My name is Damien. I'm from biotechnology student at Wageningen University. And I didn't really know about Drugs Plus before the talk. For that. With these kind of big companies investing in Drugs Plus, perhaps, I can imagine that Drugs Plus can perhaps enhance placebo effects as well. So my burning question is, how are Drugs Plus being trialed? And with possibly enhancing placebo effects, do you think that perhaps we should actually embrace placebo effects as actual medicine? Or do you think...
We do.
Absolutely.
We do.
Science being always trust. Do you think this still works? Or do you think you get
Physician effects.
Yeah, so let me just give you a bit of context. So Drugs Plus is a term that kind of we use here, but you may have heard it in a different form, which is beyond the pill, right? Treatment. So they call it many things. It's not a recognized nomenclature called Drugs Plus. What we're trying to say is that there are many other things that predict an outcome, right? Beyond just the pure effect of a drug and or the biology that you understand, that can improve the outcome or change the outcome, right? And also other ways to enhance the outcome to things that are beyond the specific biology of the drug itself. So biology is only good if you take the drug, but if I am someone who's a poor adherer, I'm not going to do it. So, you know, the future of Drugs Plus is the ability to test it in the same way that you do a registration. So we have to still have the robustness of the science. You still have to do the trials. You have to show the evidence with and without drug. So what is the contribution of the wraparound technology independent of the biological action, right? And you still have to go through the rigor of that process for evaluation to show that the evidence is present that this does have an impact on top of the biological drug. And it may find, and actually many companies are looking at this right now in different ways, that actually you can get old drugs, right? And if you put the plus solutions to them, you get to improve the outcome. You know, many of the drugs today that we try to look and say, we need a better drug for X. Well, actually, the old drugs were probably okay, but you know, if you weren't taking them or there was some other issue in certain specific groups of people that limited its use, you know, you can now find a plus solution. We can probably open up back to the old generic drugs some opportunities. So there's a whole spectrum of opportunities here to look at it. And the plus solutions can be packaged themselves. There are many of the apps today are actually plus solutions without the drug, right? So how do you improve, you know, my daily life on X? How do I get predictors of asthma? How can I predict the pollen count using a sensor that tells me, you know, for me, these are the types of environmental triggers I have. There's no drug to it. I just take in my medication. It just helps me to manage my disease better. So there are the plus solutions being registered alone. The complication is it a medical device, which has to go through a different route, or is it a technological enhancement which has a different component and has a very different regulatory framework? Okay. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment. I mean, you have a company. Are you a plus solution or are you a separate integrated solution?
I would say we're more of a separate integrated solution where the users themselves give us the data. I guess to piggyback off that answer though, I found that it's really important in healthcare to have, if you're an entrepreneur, to build a solution that allows you to work on your own first before you go on and try to integrate with other people. And the reason is that big solution providers such as Sanofi, GSK, aren't going to want to work with you until they have evidence that this actually works. And so how do you provide them evidence? You do that by what I call going to the lowest common denominator, i.e. the individual, and asking them to provide the data to you so that you can solve their problems, and then take all of that data set back to someone like GSK and Sanofi, and after that start to integrate with them. So you could be a integrated solution with a plus in the future.
Yeah, and most drug companies now are looking for things that they can adjunct to their specific diseases. So if people are developing technologies that help us to better understand patients with different diseases, they're looking to see, well, will this amplify the outcomes? Will it improve the long-term use? Will it improve adherence? Can I get a better diagnostic with it? So there's a constant scanning of the environment for every organization that's working in disease areas. So we're not just looking at the biology, we're trying to understand what else is happening in technology in these spaces as well. Okay. Yeah, you have a...
There's a lot of talk about patients bringing in their own data. I think that two things are not mentioned yet. One is in Europe, the GDPR, that has become effective as of May 28th, where in healthcare, literally each patient can ask each and every healthcare provider to send them their own data. That is going to be a huge problem, not only for institutions, but for all of us. But at the moment in time when all that semi-unstructured data is coming to someplace, maybe Apple offering that in our PHR, or Google creating that API to make from that semi-structured data structured data, there's also something else that's going to happen, because also at that point in time, patients will be able to either through their patient unions, for instance, or by themselves, ignite research. And again, to the point of Apple, I don't own any shares by the way, but Apple has created a research kit that somebody in the Netherlands, which has been done actually, can create a research for people with Parkinson's that, as opposed to 500 or 600 people being included in the study, 4,600 were included, with all the challenges that will bring. So my point here is that also citizen science will be added to all the other R&D aspects that we see right now. And I actually cannot wait for that, because those are often the low signals that, for obvious reasons, big corporates are not interested in, but do matter the most to patients, family, and informal care.
Yeah. And by the way, just to show a quick show of hands, how many of you have some sort of wearable device which tracks health? Just a show of hands. It's a huge proportion, right? It's interesting to the point. What do you do with that data or information? Whoever wants to volunteer, you can put your hand up and answer. I mean, do you take notice of it? Do you care about it? Are you aware of the algorithms that then feed back that you haven't done your prerequisite program targets for the day? And what do you do with that information? But I think it's an interesting question to see what you do as a new generation. Let's move on to another question, by the way. It's gentleman with the beige jacket.
Hi, thank you for your panel. Just as biomarkers have kind of been tied to regulatory approval now, specifically with the FDA and the European Medical Agency, do you think that regulatory agencies will demand a digital health package going along with drugs in the future? And what would something like that look like, and how would companies like Sanofi or Novo Nordisk or any other companies structure that in a way?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that we are being asked, and with that I can't disclose more at this moment, but I mean, sure, every company is now looking at how do you get the digital kind of biomarker analyses that you think is adjunctive and important enough clinically in terms of a predictive for outcome or predictive for more efficacy or predictive of safety. How do you package that with the robustness that's required for a regulator to review it? We've had an open door to be able to have a dialogue with the FDA. So they're very open to look at this. The question is, again, the quality of the data that was mentioned in the last talk. What's the source? Is the consistency of that data strong enough? What is the algorithm? What are the biases in the algorithm? So we have to be open and taking all this data and actually being able to package it up. And we're working with the regulators now to say, well, what would it take for you to recognize that and have it as an adjunctive approved digital biomarker to accompany the medication or not, right? So I think that as more of these start to emerge, the regulatory pathway of the ones that are successful will become the precedent that people will then start to follow. So I think we're all looking to see which the best ways to go are. And I don't know if...
Just a quick comment that I think
Sure.
complements. Having lived through the time where biomarkers became a potential tool by which to get drugs approved, remember that for those biomarkers, the only companies that used them were ones who felt as if they could capture a new market or come up with a monetary advantage by putting it. If you have a large market, why would you subsect that and say, I'm going to only go with this? So what's going to happen with the digital biomarkers is the same thing. Someone's going to run a trial where the digital biomarker allows them to get a strong enough signal, and they can get approval for that. It won't be for anyone without that. So the first digital biomarkers, like the old biomarkers, are going to come where a company says, I can get my approval, and therefore there's a monetary advantage to putting and associating with it, because otherwise there's really not an incentive to restrict a market.
Yeah, and it's going to be very, very interesting, because we're also looking, and there's a company called Evidation, and they're working with many companies right now to characterize also unusual things. So the behavioral biomarkers. So how do you codify a behavioral biomarker? And I mentioned what it was, the behaviorome. You know, we're just kind of coining the term now. Can you actually take characteristics that are independently predictive of an outcome to the biology that is known at the time to predict it? So there are groups now looking at the behaviorome as adjunctive markers of outcome. And I think this is all moving towards, I think, what we're discussing here. It's individualization of certain characteristics in aggregate that actually are relevant, and you can still and you can do something about it. So even if you had a characteristic, is what's its relevance, and can you do something about it? So this is when the plus solutions could come in. Can I build a service? Can I address that in some way that actually affects the outcome of that the marker is predicting? And if it's not, then it's not really helpful in its own right. But I hope that gives you a sense of some of the challenges that we're all facing in that space. Can I go to the front? Yeah, please.
Hi, Alvin Stilts at Novartis. I'd just like to roll together a couple of questions. One is, do you think we are focusing as an industry too much on the back end, as in the data, the algorithms, etc., rather than really focusing on asking the right question in the first place, especially given the problems of multiple hypothesis testing? And the second question is actually asking the panel for an estimated number. By what percentage do you think the potential of digital health, etc., has the potential to improve overall R&D productivity, value for money, or return on investment in healthcare?
I'm going to start with the latter and go around, and we'll come back to your first question. Got a view?
The second question, I think there will be digital health formularies, basically. I do think the future, and it's similar to how drugs have been hybridized, there'll be opportunities to complement with app effectiveness research and the integration of these drug treatments and the ability to see payers. So I think of IBM, for example. We sort of eat our own cooking. We've offered our employees a number of our tools to help them and their family members in a private and secure way to leverage our tools for oncology, for genomics, for clinical trials, and for wellness with this partnership with WellTalk. So I think what I'm starting to see is digital health types of interventions like that, whether it's Omada or the broad range of different, they're starting to build science, and that science will play a role in what eventually a clinician will see at the point of care in terms of what they can choose. And I think there'll be app recommendations at the point of care that this person, and then there will be a payer who will cover that, whether it's an employer, a government, or a health plan, and those will be customized.
Lucien, do you have a question to the second part?
Yeah, I'm not competent enough from a pharmaceutical standpoint of view, but as I think that healthcare is for 80% logistics, somebody has to go to the professional or the other way around, or data has to go to the professional. I think that if you approach it from that perspective, somewhere between 0 and 80% maybe even.
So I'll give you a view, and it's interesting because in Novartis you've actually done some digital deals recently, and you've made some. There are some public statements from your CEO that actually have a very profound view of what this could do. But it depends on whether you see digital as an enabler. So we still have an industry where the dialogue, I'm sure, is similar in your organization. People see, is it just taking things that we normally do, making it better, faster, cheaper, or is it actually a different approach? So we have a view that yes, you can take certain things and make it better, faster, cheaper, and that we should do that anyway. And most industries, independent of healthcare and pharma, are doing it. But the question is, can you actually converge it and create a new digital enterprise model which fundamentally changes your end-to-end process around data flow? So this comes back to your first question. Can we ask the right questions through the data that we have, not back-end, understanding the disease, which actually fundamentally makes the process of drug discovery and development around data, and you organize your organized enterprise differently to react to that. So it makes it a much more continuous process, and it takes away the traditional steps of development, because your hypothesis setting at the first is tested, rejected in an ongoing way. But you have to start with, are we asking the right questions, and do we have the data that allows us to do it? So I'm an idealist, as you can tell, that I do believe that in the future that this convergence of the tech and the pharma industry, if hybridized, can create a completely different enterprise model to do R&D and development, and will change every step. But that's a long-term view. And if that happens, we have to disrupt what we do. I can see that, just take simple things. If we can change research, make it faster, more precise, you do the predictive modeling, and you do, in a real ideal world, the trials in a real world setting, you do adaptive design. There's no phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. It then becomes transitional to real world. You do your signal detection, and you do value-based contracts at the back end of it. That's a completely different model. Okay, so.
Weighing in with a contrarian view in the near term, because I think long term, I think we're all aligned.
We're there.
Top 10 pharma, 3 to 5 years from now, is spending 30 to 50% more trying to adapt to what to do with the digital information the way it was to the genomic. It's going to cost more. So if you're running a pharma company and you're thinking you're going to be saving money in the next 3 to 5 years by bringing in digital, it's not going to happen. What I think is, somewhere in the developing countries, someone is going to take that, upend that system. In the first place it's going to happen, it's going to be a savings of 50 to 80%. 50 to 80%. Someone else is going to look and they're going to say, oh my God, they're going to eat our pie, and we'll come in. It's going to come in from the outside, I think, because I do think that the cost investment within the top 10 pharma company, they will continue to do everything that they're currently doing while they try out the next things. And so it's going to become more expensive, and then in the long run, it may get less.
And I have a view in between. So I think you can do them both together, personally. So we've got 5 minutes left for, can I take any burning questions from the audience?
I have a little bit of a provocative question, maybe. So when we talk about all the collection of data and artificial intelligence, I'm wondering, should there be a right to not to know? And also, is there an impact on your mental health? Maybe if you know already now that you'll be sick in 40 years, and maybe I would be feeling well the next 40 years without having cancer.
I think that was the point you're trying to make, so I don't know if you want to kind of embellish further on that.
In a short way, I think the dangers and some of these risks that are there are both in terms of who gets opted in and how versus opting out in terms of the data, but also the opt-in and opt-out of how you listen to the signals that may be helping yourself and what you learn about what's going to happen. And what would it be like to live in a world where you could forecast what was going to happen to people?
I'll give you a personal view. If there was nothing I could do about it today, I'd rather not know. It's obvious, but it's just a personal view for me. But then it's a question of, if you take even the 23andMe that tells you some things, if there was a way that there was information which then science was advancing in the community such that downstream I could know and do something about it, and then it was made available to me. So if it was StageGate that I was passed enough knowledge that allowed me to do something meaningful, but didn't give me the knowledge on things that I couldn't do anything about, I may feel slightly differently. But that's, again, it's a very personal view. Sorry.
I think the same is true already right now. If you're participating in whatever clinical trial, there is this question, if something comes up, do you want to know? So I also think that this is the same reality, but maybe in a different magnitude or in a different perspective. I could imagine that one. And that's also, by the way, the reason why some people asked what study their kids should try to follow, opposed to medicine or AI ethics. I think that's the new job of the future, to help out all of us have debate these kind of issues, and also young and grown-up physicians to help support them in these very tough challenges that everybody will face.
And so we face those ethical issues today. Yeah. Whenever we do a trial, okay, we actually have a policy that says we will inform you of the unintended findings that were nothing to do with the trial, as well as the trial information. So if we do a screening for a program, we find that, you know, some sophisticated diagnostics have picked up something that the patient should be aware of. We ask them, do you want to be told of that information? And we get a very mixed response today, I can tell you. So I don't think that will change too much as we go forward, okay? Anyone else?
Yeah, the right to know is a choice. That's where the patient has to provide their preference. I was speaking recently, just a couple of weeks ago, to a head of a large health system in the US based in Philadelphia, and he talked about how could Watson help him when those babies are born. Based in the community, he knows that there's a 20-year life expectancy difference in terms of the one community in Philadelphia versus another community. And I could sit there, we could give that information to the patient, but obviously that isn't necessarily a sentence that child will live that way. So I would highlight that ability to know, and that choice is very important. The other thing I just want to highlight is also the time issue. Technology has to save time for us to trust it. Currently, the use of technology in health and healthcare and life sciences has expanded time or increased time. So the question that was asked before about back office versus front office, I think there needs to be tools that leverage this AI technology like Alexa and other things to save time, like a cognitive scribe, that helps doctors build relationships with patients and take them away from the drudgery of work. Right now, 1 in 3 minutes is spent with a patient, while 2 out of 3 minutes is spent doing this as a typist or administrative tasks. And in China, they only have 3 minutes per patient. So it's hard to build a relationship when you've only got 3 minutes.
So I think we're out of time. I just wanted to say thank you for at least being awake after the lunch period for one of our goals. I hope we piqued your interest on digital health. I want to thank the panelists for a very active discussion. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you very much for your time.